Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. My name is Kupermintz, and I will be giving this session. It's my first time not speaking on a stage and actually recording one of these sessions at home. So I thank you for joining me, and I hope that it goes just as smoothly as a real talk. And of course, I hope everyone is safe and healthy, and your loved ones are doing well in this time. And I hope that I can speak about some things that are not only relevant to what we're going through right now, but also what will be necessary for us to do in order to make our societies better for whatever comes next. The title of my talk is Future Shock Against the Tyranny of the Present. And as with all of my talks, I'd like to just start by breaking apart that title and explaining the different parts of it and what I mean by these terms. A future shock is a word that was invented or was starting to be used in the last few decades, ever since the 90s. And it kind of describes a psychological state of mind where encountering new technologies or anything new from the future creates a sort of shock response inside of us, kind of like a trauma. So if you think about someone who has never seen a car and try to imagine what that feels like, seeing a car for the first time, you can imagine the shock that person experiences. Now, as we go forward and more technologies are being made common, we can expect to start experiencing future shock ourselves. And it's already happening maybe to our parents or even to us if we're old enough. You see people walking around with smartphones, you don't understand what they're doing. It's hard to adjust. As this thing accelerates, as more and more tech is being used, more and more of us will experience this kind of shock, whether it is intelligent enhancers, whether we ever go to space, that will be a big shock, and so on. But I want to look at future shock as a good thing instead of a bad thing, as something that can cause us to break loose of our limitations and our presuppositions about the world. And that's where against the tyranny of the present comes in. What do I mean by that? The present, what we're undergoing right now, has momentum, right? It defines the limits of what we think is possible and impossible. But those things are only possible and impossible because we think that they are, right? A few months before the French Revolution, if you would have asked just a person on the street of Paris whether he thought it was possible that Louis XVI would be executed within 6 months, he would have said that it was impossible. Same thing if you had asked anyone a few months before the unification of Germany. Right? It's impossible for these kingdoms that have been separate for hundreds of years to become united, and so on. The present is a tyrant. It controls us and tells us that what is happening right now is what will always happen. That's the way it's been for millennia, basically. The thing is, today, we have an even more of a tyrant present. And that is because of the economical system that we're living under, called capitalism. Capitalism has a vested interest in making us believe that capitalism will always exist and will always be the main form in which we organize our economy. That tendency of our capitalist present, to tell us that capitalism will always endure is called capitalist realism. It's a term used by leftist philosophers over the last decade, like Mark Fisher and Berardi and others, to describe this idea that reality and capitalism are one and the same. There is no alternative to capitalism because capitalism is reality. In the picture that I used for this from Occupy Wall Street, there's a sign that says capitalism is crisis, right? And when you put those two things together, you get something very problematic. Because if capitalism is reality and capitalism is crisis, that means that our reality, our present, is inherently crisis as well. And we are always going through this crisis instead of trying to fix it. Now, when I wrote this talk, I didn't know about the COVID-19 outbreak, obviously, but it has become even more pertinent, right? We are constantly dealing with crisis. Now, there are those who would like to say this has nothing to do with capitalism. This is a black swan event. It's something that no one could have foreseen, and that is not systematic. It's just a part of reality. But that is 100% wrong. In fact, this crisis was foreseen by many people in the last 5 to 10 years that have foresaw the kind of disease that we are handling today. And the reason they foresaw it has to do with capitalism and what we do to animals, what we do to the wilderness, what we do to nature, our industry, and so on. But that's not what it's about, so I don't have time to go into all of that. There's a lot of literature about it online if you're interested in learning about it more. Literally just Google COVID-19 and capitalism and you'll get a bunch of stuff, and really clever stuff as well. What I want to do is, during this talk, is explore how future shock can actually free us from these shackles, from the capitalist realism, can actually put us in a state, that shock that I talked about, that allows us to think outside of the box that capitalist realism would put us in. The problem is that capitalist realism is everywhere. It's in our culture, it's in the way we think, it's even in our memes, right? This idea of capitalist realism has also become a meme. This is a meme taking Scooby-Doo and putting a very common Mark Fisher idea into it, that capitalism would like us to think that depression is only chemical imbalances in the brain, but it's hiding from us the way that the abstract and impersonal force of capital actually causes those mental states like depression and anxiety and so on. So capitalist realism is everywhere, and so is capitalism itself. It tries to control us not through only police officers and violence and armies and so on, but also through memes and cultural understanding. So I'd like to explore that cultural understanding and how it reinforces capitalist realism and how it tells us that the future will always be capitalist and that the only options are either a utopia that exists or a dystopia, which is a disaster and doesn't allow us for a third option. And then see how thinking about the future in more interesting ways through science fiction and through other genres can help us break that duopoly of capitalism down, right? Break that polarity between utopia and dystopia. Okay, that's going to be our goal. So one of the responses within culture to capitalist realism is to actually try and resist capitalist realism, try and resist this chokehold that capitalist realism has on us by appealing to hope, right? Things seem so impossible, so set in stone, so tyrannical, that the only thing that people can see as an alternative is hoping for a better future. But what I want to say is that this is not a good way to deal with capitalist realism, because it's just a post-capitalist realism. It does the same thing, except it changes the aesthetics a bit. The aesthetics of hope are bright and sunny and beautiful. What's actually been called in the last year and a half or so hope punk, right? Taking cyberpunk and steampunk and those genres, changing one word and calling it hope punk. So this is a name for an aesthetic, a genre, literature, music, blog posts, art that imagines a brighter future. Supposedly a future post-capitalism, a future where we have triumphed. It sees us coming to terms with climate change and using technology to move beyond centralization. A future in which each one of us can control their own electricity through solar panels or wind turbines, as you can see in the image here, control our own livelihood, make the planet green again by planting trees where we are, and in general, a very, not individualist, but a very fragmentary, localized version to counter capitalism's globalization and tyrannical nature. So what's the problem? That sounds great. It sounds like a future where we can live together with the planet and so on. The problem is in the term hope. I want to say that feeding into the narrative or using hope is feeding into the narrative of capitalist realism. It's that utopia that capitalism puts in front of our face as an alternative to itself. And why does capitalism do that? It does that because hope is passive. When you hope for something, you hope that something will happen to you, that something will come about. You don't hope that you will do something. You don't hope that you will make a revolution happen. You don't hope that you will change the way that capital works. You hope that capital will change. You hope that climate change will stop. You hope that these problems will somehow resolve themselves or will be resolved. And that's what capitalism wants you to think. It wants you to wait for the utopia while everything is destroyed around us. It wants you to wait for a miracle. So what I think we should do is abandon hope, right? Because summer is not coming. Like the famous quote from Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, winter is coming, summer is not coming. It's not a question of just waiting for the clock to run down, for the seasons to change, for something to sweep through the nation. If you think about it, that is kind of the message of movements like the Obama administration, right? Hope and change. A new dawn is coming. A new age is coming. But how? When you ask them that question, how is a new age coming? How is all those wind turbines and all those solar panels and those localized resistances, how will it happen? They don't have an answer. Because hope is not about answers. Hope is about waiting for something to happen. Now, this is not my idea. A lot of philosophers have been thinking about hope. One of them is the very famous, mostly religious, but also ethical philosopher called Baruch Spinoza. And he has a really good quote that I put on here. Hope is a joy not constant, arising from the idea of something future or past, about the issue of which we sometimes doubt. We don't know if it's going to happen or not, and we have a joy when we think about it. But the flip side is fear, because fear is a sorrow not constant, arising from the idea of something future or past, about the issue of which we sometimes doubt. It's exactly the same, and that's why he wrote those sentences one after the other. Hope and fear, or despair, are the same. We are not sure that something is coming, and we feel either joy or sorrow when we think about it. We don't think about what our part is in it. We just think about what we feel about it, if it will happen to us. And that's why the opposite is also not a good idea. That dystopia that capitalism or cultural capitalism wants you to consider, right? The end of the world. The only way to get rid of capitalism is by everything collapsing. Don't touch the Jenga tower, right? Don't touch the house of cards, because if you pull the wrong card, everything comes crashing down and we end up with a dystopia. Winter is also not coming. There will not be a romantic collapse for you to imagine yourself as a hero in. You will never be this hot. You will never be this sexy as the Hollywood stars in Mad Max or Children of Men. This will never be you looking out of a broken window with rugged hope in your eyes after the world has ended. This will never be you crouching over a motorcycle with a sniper rifle, screaming your defiance at the world and the desert that has become. That's not how collapses will look like. It will look like a mosaic. Little places going better, getting worse, collapsing, reforming. It will be chaos. And it won't happen to you. You will be the ones to do it. Right? You will be the ones to either bring it about or prevent it. But the capitalist paradigm has us locked within those two poles. Either something amazing will happen and the world will be transformed and hope and change will flourish and everything will be okay, or everything will collapse and we'll all have to be romantic heroes screaming for redemption and so on. But we need to break out of that polarity, because I hope you agree with me, both those options are bad. The utopia will never happen, and the dystopia is terrible, right? Millions of people, hundreds of millions of people will suffer. So we need to find a way to break out of this duality that has us shackled. And the way to do that is with future shock, or with what I call, not me personally, the industry in general is calling the new weird, right? Artists, writers, musicians, politicians, I hope, and others that are imagining a future that doesn't sit into those two polarities, into those two poles, right? That tries to imagine a weirder, more nuanced, more strange future. Because while summer is not coming, and winter is not coming either, the future is coming. The future is the only thing that is coming. And the future is inherently weird, right? And by weird, I mean I'm using like Freud's definition of unheimlich. I'm sorry for mispronouncing the German, but this idea of something that is foreign, that is new to us, that is different, but that is still within us. We still communicate with it. The future is always ahead, always not happening yet, but also always happening to us at the same time. It's weird. So I want to explore a few works from this new weird, very diverse number of works, to show you what I mean and how this art breaks apart the duality of the capitalist future and tries to imagine a third or a weirder future. So the first book is actually by a German novelist called Elvia Wilk. It's called Oval. It was published in the last 2 years. Forgive me, I don't remember the exact date. And I took this summary from a site called Subtext Books, the publishers, and it does a really neat job of summarizing what's in the book. The book is about Berlin. In the next 20 to 30 years, climate change has really struck and weather has become completely unpredictable, and one giant corporation is slowly taking over Berlin. Sounds familiar? It's kind of how Berlin is today, right? Only accelerated much, much faster. Artists are being used by brands to whitewash their and greenwash their capitalist abuses of the planet. That should also sound familiar, especially to people who go to Republica. And within all of this, a scientist tries to find a new direction. And the book does a really good job of describing new tech, right? Not just another wearable, not just a speedier car or an electric car, but tech like growing houses from biological materials, or how do zero-emission houses actually look? And while it's exploring this new tech, it also asks a very important question that capitalism doesn't want you to ask, which is, what does this tech look like when it breaks down? Not in a romantic way, not in a Mad Max way, in a common day-to-day way. You know, when you take out your wireless headphones and you try to pair them with your phone and it doesn't work, and you have to turn off your phone and turn it on again, and you have to download an update. That's exactly what's going to happen to all these future technologies that capitalism is promising us, right? How does that look? How do we react to it? It also does a really good job of taking that tech and the social political fabric in which it lies and tying it into personal relationships. How do relationships, romantic relationships, look like in this future? How does this new discourse break down those relationships? How does this new tech integrate into these relationships? And instead of choosing either so this is bad or this is good, Wilk does a really good job of towing the line, right in the middle, in that weird place of, this is kind of good, this is kind of bad, there's good stuff about it, there's bad stuff about it. We kind of have to take it in stride and think about our place inside of this. And lastly, the book also asks a lot of questions about, in what way are we complicit in these systems? Where can I exit? Where can I stop? Where can I resist when the system is all around me? When the corporation controls everything I do, I live in a house that the corporation built, how do I still defy the ruling order of the day? The second piece of work I want to talk about, also a book, is by Jeff Vandermeer, very famous author right now. He wrote Annihilation, which later became a movie by Alex Garland. But he also recently published, in the last few months, he published a book called Dead Astronauts, which is the second book in his, or third book in his ongoing Born series. And it's much weirder than Wilk's, but in different and interesting ways. In it, there's a company making biomechanical adaptations to animals and bodies. And whatever they make is very weird. Flying bears or fish that have alcohol in their blood. So when you eat them, you get drunk. Beetles that crawl into your ear and translate languages or whisper knowledge to you. The thing is, the company and also the whole of humanity has caused society to collapse. But again, not the romantic collapse of Mad Max. There's no roving heroes or romantic, conquering of yourself. There is just reality, a reality of a broken down, malfunctioning planet. And into this reality step three very interesting people. Each of them has their own ability to see the world for what it is, and they kind of have to make sense of this broken system. Knowledge is no longer linear, right? Science is kind of broken down in different areas of the city in which the story takes place, or even versions of that city. New realities and the laws of reality are different. Now, that sounds fantastical. What the hell does that have to do with our lives? It's already happening in our lives, right? If you go to different cities in different parts of the planet, you find new codes for how reality works, because capitalism is able to rewire those codes. Don't believe me? Try dressing like you would for Berlin and then going to Paris. Or try making a business transaction like you would in London. Try and do it in New York. You will not be able to. Even though capitalism wants us to think about it as some sort of monopoly, some sort of one grand totality in which everything is the same, and that is its promise, it is actually fragmentary to the extreme. What Vandermeer does in this book is show us when these processes of climate change and the collapse of capitalism, which is coming, will happen, our way of perceiving reality itself gets twisted and shattered. I'd love to say a whole lot more about this book, but it is really bizarre. So I just suggest reading it and thinking about these ideas of like what happens when our social order collapses, not what guns will shoot, but how it changes the way we think about reality and the way we interact with our world. The other piece of work that I want to talk about is actually not art, or wasn't supposed to be art, whatever that means. It's actually something called the Human Interference Task Force. And it is a real task force that was convened by the US government in 1981 to deal with the question of how will we communicate radioactive waste warnings to people 10,000 years in the future. Now we know that the question is actually harder because nuclear waste actually can survive 100,000 years or 200,000 years. How do we keep those warnings in place? You can't write Achtung or danger, because who knows if they'll speak English or not, or German? Who knows if they'll have a language that even resembles us? So how do we do it? And they gathered semiotic experts, architects, artists, engineers, and so on to build this task force. And the report is fascinating. So they had some images like this with the faces that are supposedly communicating anxiety and fear and danger. But they also made architectural plans, spikes that come out of the earth that are supposed to be very overbearing and foreboding to communicate the sense of danger. The code I used from Shelley's Ozymandias, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," was actually quoted by one of them in the report. And these reports give us a view into the future that is not obvious and is not romantic. It asks a specific and very, very difficult question. How do we talk to someone that lives 10,000 years in the future? And how do we stop them from potentially killing not only themselves, but every other person that is near them? In order to help them with this, they also opened the question up to the audience, to the people around the world through journals. Very famous people wrote in, like Stanislav Lem, a Polish science fiction author, and others less famous, and they had many ideas. Cats that glow in the dark and warn people that something is weird, codifying messages into the DNA of flowers, and so on and so forth. It's really fascinating documents which you can find online. And they give you a glimpse of how to look at the future differently, right? How to ask important, scary, remember future shock, scary, traumatic questions. When we all die, when all of our civilization collapses, when even our language collapses, the pollution, in this case radioactive pollution, that we have caused will still be our responsibility. What do we do with that? And how does it interact with our actions today? One last note on this. This was never implemented. Never. The US government has still not implemented any of these suggestions. Even worse, to this day, there is not one single unique dumping site for nuclear waste in the US, right? So this just goes to show you how the future and our thoughts about the future are incompatible with our past, with our present, what will be our past. The last piece of work I want to talk about is a piece of music. If we were in the same room and I had a stage, I would also play you a song, but I can't. It's from a band called Clipping. The album is called Splendour and Misery, and it is a science fiction concept album that has a lot of interaction with African-American slavery and Afrofuturism. In it, a slave breaks free and basically uses a ship's faster-than-light engine to launch himself through time and space, and through that fight against the regime that is using his body as a resource. Now, the parallels to the present day should be obvious. You can look at the shackles that the figure in this album art is wearing and think about modern day imprisonment in the US. Yes, also slavery in the past, but also slavery as it is going on today with the mass incarceration system under capitalism. And what this album is doing is using the future to explore ideas of African American liberation, identity, reparations, and rebellion. It does so in a very interesting way. It sounds like you're just listening to a story about the future, but you're actually listening to a manifesto about liberation in the present day. And it can serve to break down your biases and break down your presuppositions by taking these subjects and prefiguring or configuring them differently in the future. And it's a really interesting example of everything I'm trying to say here. How we can use the far future, spaceships, faster than light travel, lasers, time travel to say things about the present. So we're running out of time. So I want to get to what's the point? Okay, we've spoken about this whole thing. Why are we talking about this? Why is it so important to me that we learn how to better think about the future and embrace the weirdness of the future so we can break down the present? The point is that we stop writing articles like this. If you Google today what the world will look like after the coronavirus pandemic, you will find hundreds of thousands of hits. Out of them, hundreds of articles that are actually trying to predict the future after the coronavirus pandemic. I didn't leave the names or the publication in this screenshot on purpose because it really doesn't matter what article we're talking about. The point is that people are already trying to predict the future, but they're doing a really bad job at it because they think about what will change. How will public transportation change? How will technology change? How will conferences change? How will conferencing technology change? But they're not asking the important questions. The important question is, how do we prevent this from happening again? And more than that, into the present, why did this happen? And why are we handling it so poorly, right? You can make the claim that maybe in Germany, they're doing a bit better, or in Israel, where I live as well. But if you look at the US and Italy and Spain and other nations around the world, we are botching our this. And it has everything to do with the tyranny of our current structures of thought and the tyranny of capitalism. That we cannot think of alternatives even while we see millions of people potentially dying of this pandemic that was created by the way we do things as we do them today. We have that instinct to speculate. We have that instinct to ask questions about the future, but we don't have that instinct to ask them on the present, to take it from the future back to the present. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to do that so we don't get articles like this while the world still looks like this. This is mass graves being dug in New York. While this is happening, these people are speculating about how your bus ride to work might look different, right? How will your food change while people are being buried in mass graves? The question is, what about the future can help us prevent this from ever happening again? And I believe that together, if we think about the future in more radical, weird, and interesting ways, we can do that. Not with hope, but with weapons to critique what we're going under right now. Thank you.